Chapter 6: The Second Period of Bolshevik Rule in Ukraine. A. The Bolshevik approach to the Ukrainian problem. During the period of the Directory and the advance of the Soviet Red Army into Ukraine, Borot'bist policy veered toward the Bolshevik platform. In order to understand the situation which faced the Borot'bisti in late January 1919, it is necessary briefly to trace Bolshevik participation in the uprising against the Hetmanate. With the collapse of German power in the fall of 1918, the Council of People's Commissars in Moscow decided on November 11 to direct the Revolutionary Military Council of the Russian Soviet Federated Socialist Republic to launch an attack within 10 days in support of the workers and peasants of Ukraine who were rebelling against the Hetman. For this purpose, a revolutionary council consisting of Georgy L. Pyatakov, Volodymyr P. Zatonsky, J.V. Stalin, and Vladimir A. Antonov Ovseyenko was established in the Kursk frontier area on November 17, 1918. At the same time, a provisional workers' and peasants' government of Ukraine headed by Pyatakov was formed. The servants of an empire are often more aggressive in the dominions than in the mother country. It was Pyatakov who provided the theoretical justification for the empirical attitude of the Russian Bolsheviks in Ukraine, who regarded everything Ukrainian as counter-revolutionary and destructive of all Russian proletarian unity. On the national question, Pyatakov shared the views of the German Social Democrat leader Rosa Luxemburg, who regarded the national struggle for independence as detrimental to the interests of the proletarian revolution. A man of extraordinary willpower, Pyatakov engineered conflicts between the Directory and the Council of People's Commissars in Moscow. In opposition to the Borot'bisti, the Ukrainian SD independents, and even some local Bolsheviks, he advocated a policy of direct intervention in the Russian Red Army. Pyatakov and his associates did not believe that the Bolsheviks would gain a following among the workers and peasants in Ukraine. On November 11, 1918, Yakov A. Epstein, pseudonym Yakov Lev, a Yekaterinoslav Bolshevik, declared that although the workers and many of the peasants, especially in Chernigov province, are on our side, there is no basis for thinking that a pro-Bolshevik revolutionary movement can arise that alone succeed in Ukraine without the support of considerable forces of the Red Army. And in fact, the Ukrainians rebelled against the Hetmanate under both democratic and leftist Soviet slogans. A centralist at heart, Pyatakov tolerated the existence of a Ukrainian Soviet government, but firmly opposed any compromise with Ukrainian realities or with the Ukrainian left-wing pro-Soviet parties. In the Bolshevik view, the view which is today official communist policy, the rights of man and nations are relative rather than absolute. They arise in the process of transition from old to new social conditions. These rights, according to the Bolsheviks, manifested themselves clearly for the first time during the French Revolution, yet the stage of development of the forces of production in 18th century France made their full realization impossible. In order to win complete freedom, the theory runs, it was necessary to destroy the existing and antiquated social forms. History has assigned this task to the working class, whose aims were to be realized by the Bolshevik Party. Everything would have to be subordinated to this goal, since its realization was the prerequisite for other liberties, among them the freedom of subjugated peoples who could never achieve real equality under the old social conditions. For the Bolsheviks, the national problem was therefore of secondary importance. Lenin stated that the Bolsheviks did not support every national movement of liberation, but only those which advanced the struggle for the liberation of the proletariat. This was the basic ideological distinction between the Bolsheviks and the Borot'bisti. It is important, however, to bear in mind the fact that the Bolsheviks never openly repudiated the equal rights of the Ukrainian peoples. The Bolsheviks became strong in Ukraine primarily because they had the support of the Red Army. Yet this fact does not completely explain their success. They controlled 85% of the seats in the Kyiv Sindy Council of Workers' Deputies during the Directory. Bolshevik influence was equally strong in the Donetsk Basin and the urban areas of the provinces of Kharkiv, Yekaterinoslav, and Odessa. The fact that the Bolsheviks commanded the vital political centers, the cities, was enough in itself to make them powerful in Ukraine. In the final analysis, the proximity of Ukraine to Red Russia precluded successful competition with the Russian Bolsheviks, who regarded Ukraine as merely one more battlefield in the civil war. B. Borot'bist efforts to form a government. The Borot'bists stood for the complete equality of Ukraine and Russia, guided by their belief in the inalienable rights of personal and national freedom. They too had the proletarian revolution at heart, for social liberation was the realization of man's right to equality. But that was precisely why they attacked the national policy of the Bolsheviks, which in their view obstructed the strengthening of Soviet government in Ukraine. They accused the Bolsheviks of abetting by their policy Petlurism and making this movement popular even with social classes which ought to have been on the Soviet side. Taught by the experience of the Muravyov period of Bolshevik rule in Ukraine in early 1918, the Borot'bisti in January 1919 worked for A. the organization of a separate national Ukrainian army, B. an independent and separate administration of the Ukrainian economy, and C. an intensification of Ukrainization. 1. The Borot'bist Central Revolutionary Committee. Hristyuk mentions a Borot'bist Chief Revolutionary Committee consisting of Shinkar, Mikhailichenko, Blakidny, Shumsky, Litvinenko, and Lashkevich, which participated in the organization of the uprising against the Hetmanate. Dissatisfied with the Directory's policy, the committee, in league with the Russian Bolsheviks, directed an uprising against the Directory throughout left-bank Ukraine. As far as can be ascertained, this is the same committee with a slight modification in name as the Borot'bist Central Revolutionary Committee, which became active in mid-January, the Ukrainian SR's Borot'bisti, vacillating between the Directory and the Bolsheviks, were an important political group which formed the so-called Central Revolutionary Committee, headed by Khnat Mikhailichenko. Rafis devotes considerable attention to the conflict of this Borot'bist center with the Bolsheviks and the attitude which the Jewish Bund adopted toward it. The formation of Pyatakov's government in Kharkiv, consisting solely of members of the Communist Party, was highly embarrassing to all of us. We regard it as an attempt to ignore all other groups at the risk of causing friction with that part of the peasantry which supported the Borot'bisti. In the middle of January, because of this friction, the party of Ukrainian SR's Borot'bisti created its own government, the Council of Revolutionary Emissaries, paralleling the Bolshevik Kharkiv government. This was no mere gesture, since the Borot'bisti carried on extensive work and mustered large partisan units. The creation of the second government was also very disturbing to us, the Bund. As a result, the Bureau of the Bund called a special meeting which adopted the following attitude toward this conflict. Having heard the declaration of the Council of Chief Revolutionary Emissaries, formed by the party of Ukrainian SR's Borot'bisti, the meeting has come to the following conclusion. 1. The formation of the center solely by the party of Ukrainian SR's Borot'bisti, which draws its support exclusively from the Ukrainian peasantry, and without agreement with the other parties which accepted the platform of Soviet rule, in particular the Communist Party, is a sign of growing friction between the urban proletariat and the poorer strata of the peasantry. 2. Under the difficult international circumstances in which the fight for the establishment of Soviet rule is being and will continue to be waged during the initial period following its institution, this fight is being aggravated in Ukraine by the national differences between the city and the village, and conceals in itself consequences extremely dangerous for the whole revolution in Ukraine. Thus, the task of all adherents of Soviet rule is to make every effort to liquidate the imminent conflict by means of agreement among the revolutionary sources parties. 3. As an organization which relies on the support of the urban proletarian masses, the Bund is in this conflict cannot in any event tie itself with the center formed by the Ukrainian SR's Borot'bisti. In endeavoring to achieve an agreement, it should limit itself to the propagation of its platform among the working masses, and by the influence it thus gains, to the continuation of its revolutionary activity in the organs of the Executive Committee of the Kyiv City Council, in close contact with the political organization of the Communists. Thus, the minority party, the Bund, troubled as it was by the conflict between the Bolsheviks and Borot'bisti, came to support the stronger side, the Bolsheviks. 2. Attempted use of Grigoriev's army. The first item on the Borot'bist political agenda in their endeavor to establish a Soviet but non-Bolshevik government in Ukraine was the formation of an independent Ukrainian army. The source of manpower and military skill for such an army was to be the partisan army of Ataman Grigoriev, who had succeeded in uniting under his command many Borot'bist partisan detachments in southern Ukraine, which had kept aloof from Bolshevik influence after the uprising against the Hetmanate. Ukrainian historians who maintain that Grigoriev betrayed the Directory overlook his role as a Borot'bist partisan leader and forget that the Borot'bisti never recognized the Directory. Before the uprising against the Directory, according to one Soviet source, Grigoriev was, it would appear, a district emissary of the Borot'bist Central Revolutionary Committee. This would indicate that in the Borot'bist movement, Grigoriev was politically a new man, since the rank of district party emissary was certainly low for a military leader of his caliber. There is only one set of documents available which shed light on the cautious, although under the circumstances quite daring, attempt of the Borot'bist Central Revolutionary Committee to contend with the Bolsheviks in the creation of a Ukrainian Red Army. The documents record the negotiations between Grigoriev and the Soviet High Command in the last days of January 1919, when the Bolshevik Red Army was already deep in Ukraine. The following telegram from Grigoriev to the Bolshevik Revolutionary Committee in Alexandrovsk, now Zaporozhye, initiated the negotiations. I, the ataman of the partisans in Kherson province and Taurida, wish to speak with the representatives of the governmental authority in Alexandrovsk and transmit very important information to it. Will a representative of this authority speak with me? I shall at once advise you of my platform. If the authority in Alexandrovsk is democratic, not cadet. Therefore listen with the capitulation of the Directory on January 25, 1919, new style, Soviet rule has been proclaimed in Ukraine. The Directory has fallen. To replace the Directory, a new government has been formed of left SR's Borot'bisti and Ukrainian Bolsheviks. Members of the new government include Gnat Mikhailichenko, Mykola Shinkar, Kolosov Shumsky, Vasil Blakitny, Vyacheslav Lashkevich, and Mykola Litvinenko. Revolutionary headquarters of the Central Revolutionary Committee is located in Kharkiv. Do you know about this? All 20 of my partisan units are fighting against the independents, i.e. nationalists, and the supporters of the world bourgeoisie. We are against the Directory, the cadets, the English, the Germans, and the French, whom the bourgeoisie have brought to Ukraine. We are not against the toiling people of Germany or France or other states. We fight only those who protect the bourgeoisie. The toiling peasants and the workers are with us. Right now, a declaration of the Council of Revolutionary Emissaries to the Ukrainian people, the peasants, and the proletariat is being printed. Keep in touch with Apostolovo by telegraph. Tomorrow, the declaration will be transmitted for distribution among the people. Councils and land committees must be introduced everywhere. I am now sending a delegation to Alexandrovsk to verify the type of government which is being established in that area. Having described the strength and distribution of his forces, Grigoriev continued. Vinnichenko, it is said, went to Soviet Russia to conduct negotiations, but his mission was too late. Several representatives of the new government in Ukraine proclaimed Soviet rule in order to avoid strife within democracy and in order to achieve that which our weary and betrayed toiling people have so long awaited. Our motto is, all power to the councils and dictatorship of the proletariat. The Soviet historians of these events contends that Grigoriev was confused over recent political developments. Mikhailichenko, Blakitny, Shumsky, and other leaders of the Ukrainian SR's Borot'bisti were organizers of the Central Revolutionary Committee in opposition to the Directory, but were not members of the Provisional Revolutionary Government Bolshevik, although the Central Revolutionary Committee sent Blakitny, Ilansky, and Maistrenko Lashkevich to negotiate an agreement with the Bolsheviks. At first glance, it might appear that Grigoriev really was ignorant of the political developments. His reference to a new Soviet, Borot'bist-controlled government in Kharkiv, headed by Mikhailichenko, seems to strengthen this view. However, a later telegram from Christian Rakovsky to Georgy Chicherin Soviet Commissar of Foreign Affairs, makes it clear that a government headed by Mikhailichenko did exist in Znamenka, very near Grigoriev's headquarters. From Grigoriev's reference to Kharkiv, it can thus be argued that he intentionally filled the new Kharkiv Bolshevik government with Borot'bism. In any event, other available evidence confirms the view that Grigoriev, while negotiating with the Bolsheviks, was not improvising but was acting in accordance with someone's definite plan. Having relayed its conversation with Grigoriev to the high command of the Kharkiv government of Soviet armies, the Alexandrovsk Revolutionary Committee received the following telegram from Vladimir Ausun. To the Military Revolutionary Committee in the city of Alexandrovsk. Having heard the report of the representatives of your committee on the negotiations between your delegation and Ataman Grigoriev, I have to inform you that the High Command of the Ukrainian Soviet Red Army can enter into negotiations or agreements only upon these conditions: unconditional recognition of Soviet authority in Ukraine as represented by the Provisional Workers and Peasants Government, which is in Kharkiv and which is headed by comrades Pyatakov, Kotsubinsky, Rakovsky, Artyom, and others in subordination to the high military command of the Soviet Red Army of Ukraine. Should these conditions be acceptable, it is suggested that Ataman Grigoriev appear in person or send his representatives to the city of Yekaterinoslav for negotiations, which will be conducted with him by comrades Dybenko and Petrenko on behalf of the military command and by someone to be authorized on behalf of the government. The representatives should be accompanied by a member of the Alexandrovsk Revolutionary Committee, safeguarded by special pass to be issued by the aforementioned Revolutionary Committee. It is understood that the representatives will be guaranteed safe conduct. Commandant of the Kharkov Group of Troops of the Soviet Army, Ausun. Senior Adjutant Shurzenko. From the tone of Ausem's telegram, it is obvious that the Bolsheviks, while recognizing the importance of Grigoriev's partisan army, felt sufficiently strong to demand his complete submission. The progress of the negotiations can be followed in the records preserved of a direct wire conversation between Grigoriev and the authorized Bolshevik representative Petrenko on February 1st, 1919. Grigoriev: I am Ataman Grigoriev. Petrenko: I am Chief of Staff of the Special Group Petrenko. Grigoriev: Good afternoon, Comrade Petrenko. What has my delegation achieved and when can I expect it back? Petrenko: You alone are responsible for the delay. We are awaiting your reply. Do you agree to recognize the Revolutionary Military Council of the Ukrainian Soviet Army as the only military center? Grigoriev: Such a council should be formed from representatives of our center and yours. We have almost the same platform as you and have our own Central Revolutionary Committee. In my opinion, it would be most advisable to unite our armies and high commands into one. It would be a little awkward to subordinate one army to the other. As of today, we have approximately 100,000 men on all fronts, 30,000 partisans, and the remainder regular units. The fast-moving military events on February 1st, 1919 were turning to the advantage of the Bolsheviks. The Directory's army was in retreat before the Bolsheviks advancing on Kiev. In view of this, Grigoriev's figure of 100,000 men under his command was probably an exaggeration. The conversation between Petrenko and Grigoriev continues as follows. Petrenko: Comrade Grigoriev, we do not want to resort to propaganda and agitation. I think you must realize the present situation. There is in Ukraine the Provisional Workers and Peasants Government, which consists of Bolsheviks and leftist Tsars. Borot'bism. It is headed by Rakovsky. Of the leftist Tsars, I know so far only one. Do you wish to recognize this government and accept the supremacy of the Revolutionary Military Council appointed by it? We have nothing else to talk about. Compromises and contacts will be established later in the party centers upon agreements between the Bolsheviks and leftist Tsars. Grigoriev: Our movement consists almost entirely of leftist Tsars, except that my chief of staff and his aide are Bolsheviks. In order to halt the advance of the English, French, Germans, and cadets, whom I have been fighting for 4 days, we should combine our front. You must realize that yesterday and today I fought stiff battles against 42 echelons of Ukrainian nationalists and Galicians. In Znamenka, I myself, my staff, and our partisans are ready to extend to you a brotherly hand, but without authority from our center, with which I have been out of touch for the 2nd day. I wish to regard our agreement objedania, or more exactly my agreement with you, as tactical operativnym. I agree to your conditions and recognize your supreme command provided that in future the problem concerning unification of the higher command rests with your center and ours. I think that your command and ours will reach an agreement since we shall not argue over the problem of authority. Power should belong to the people through their elected representatives. Our supreme authority and yours are temporary and revolutionary. The permanent government will be formed not by us or by you, but by the people. What do you say to this? Petrenko. The Congress of Soviets, which will be held early in March, will elect the government. You will learn more details about this in the declaration of the Workers' and Peasants' Government. I shall now report your agreement to our command. With your delegation, we shall begin to discuss the shortening of the front. The rest we shall leave to the party centers. The results of his conversation with Grigoriev, Petrenko now reported to Ausem by telephone. Chief of Staff Petrenko on the phone. I wish to inform you that agreement with Ataman Grigoriev was reached at 1500 hours today. Ataman Grigoriev has accepted our conditions, has recognized the supreme authority of the Provisional Workers and Peasants Government and the military command of the Revolutionary Military Council, stipulating the possibility of further negotiations between his center, that is, the leftist Borot'bism government, and our center. He commands forces in the area from Alexandrovsk to Kherson and Nikolaev, along the right bank of the Dnieper. He is in complete control of the Nikolaev-Znamenka railway line, just outside Nikolaev and Novopavlovka station. Ausem. Once Grigoriev has accepted our terms, it will be possible to begin regrouping his units. Have him tell us just what units he has and give us exact, not fantastic figures. The point about future negotiations with his center, or as you put it, the SR government, is rather vague. There is no such center, at least not in Kharkiv, as he says in his first telegram. Vasil Blakiny is here, but he doesn't know about the center. Please tell him this and do not agree to conduct any negotiations with the center. Petrenko. When I transmit to you the contents of our telephone conversation with Grigoriev, the picture will become clearer. Blakiny's name appears under the Declaration of People's Commissariat to the Ukrainian people and soldiers. We have a copy of this declaration and Averin knows of it too. The delegation cannot furnish exact details of its forces since these are partisans. The Central Revolutionary Committee, as the supreme authority is known, is located in Znamenka. It is said that there are in all 20 units, 23,000 men strong, with some artillery and a considerable number of machine guns. Grigoriev's chief of staff was not, as he said, a Bolshevik, but the very popular partisan leader Yurko Tutunik. Moreover, the Borot'bism Central Revolutionary Committee was in Znamenka, the location of Grigoriev's headquarters. His account of being cut off for 2 days was merely a political maneuver. The Borot'bism Central Revolutionary Committee did not want to participate directly in the negotiations since it was already holding talks with the Bolsheviks in Kharkiv. Grigoriev's negotiations must therefore be regarded as a diplomatic move by the Borot'bisti in an attempt to impress the Kharkiv Bolsheviks with Borot'bist military strength. However, because the bargaining power of the Borot'bisti was small, Grigoriev readily accepted Bolshevik supremacy, albeit conditionally. He had the choice of joining either the 10 popular Red Army or the unpopular army of the Ukrainian People's Republic. By siding with the Bolsheviks, he had little to lose. On the one hand, he retained command of his forces, while on the other hand, Bolshevik support enabled him to carry out a successful campaign against the French and Denikin's volunteer army in the south. On March 9, 1919, Grigoriev retook Kherson, on March 12, Nikolaev, and on April 4, Odessa, thus becoming a popular hero fighting under the slogan, "Drive the Entente into the sea." Finally, there is Rakovsky's telegram concerning the Bolshevik agreement with Grigoriev to the Moscow Commissar of Foreign Affairs Chicherin. Moscow to Chicherin, copy to Lenin, Trotsky, Sverdlov. On February 1st, an agreement was reached between representatives of our army, which is operating on the border of Yekaterinoslav and Kherson provinces, and Ataman Grigoriev. He is a Ukrainian SR who commands considerable partisan forces and is operating in Kherson province on a continuous front as far as Nikopol. Grigoriev has recognized the supremacy of the authority of the Provisional Workers and Peasants Government of Ukraine and the command of the Revolutionary Military Council, leaving it to the Ukrainian SR government, established on the right bank of the Dnieper to negotiate a political agreement with us. Two representatives of the Ukrainian SRs, Ilansky and Blakidny, are here, but negotiations have not yet begun, Rakovsky. To confront the Bolsheviks with an already existing Borot'bist-controlled Ukrainian Soviet government, supported by a Borot'bist-controlled Ukrainian Red Army, was the only move open to the Borot'bisti. The documents indicate beyond the shadow of a doubt that the Borot'bisti attempted to do this, but the balance of military and political forces was not in their favor. The more experienced administrative and military personnel of Ukraine had withdrawn to the west with the Directory, leaving the Borot'bisti exposed to the organized machine of the Russian Bolsheviks. The Borot'bisti had little control in the cities, and had they declared war on the Bolsheviks in the winter of 1919, their large following in the villages would probably have refused to support them. The masses would not have understood why two parties with the same political platform, Soviet rule, should fight one another, especially when the threat of intervention by the Allies in the south and by the Directory in the west had yet to be removed. A minor but contributing factor to Borot'bist's failure was their hostile relations with the independent wing of the USDRP, which were rooted in ideological differences. In attempting to shake off the tag of idealistic populism and their evolution towards communism, the Borot'bisti lived through a period of ideological eclipse. The Ukraine as the independents have gone through the same Marxist school as the Bolsheviks, could withstand them better than could the Borot'bisti, whom the independents regarded with contempt. The Borot'bisti, on the other hand, feeling more closely identified with the masses, looked on the independents as friends of the Directory and hence bourgeois. Collaboration between the two Ukrainian parties of the left was thus impossible. C. Implementation of Bolshevik occupation policy. The decline in prestige of the Ukrainian state among the masses as a result of Hetman rule, together with the advice of Bolshevik leaders in Ukraine, was undoubtedly behind Lenin's remarks at the 8th Congress of the Russian Communist Party Bolshevik in March 1919 that Ukraine is separated from Russia by exceptional circumstances. The national movement has not taken deep roots there. Even if it did exist, the Germans stamped it out. Prior to the arrival of the Bolshevik Soviet government from Kharkiv, the Bolshevik-controlled executive committee of the Kyiv City Council, contending with a host of Ukrainian problems, named four Borot'bisti among the special commissars appointed to take over the various ministries vacated by the Directory: Mikhailichenko Foreign Affairs, Panas Lyubchenko War, Taranenko Rationing, and Kluney Agriculture. However, the Soviet government headed by Rakovsky, who replaced Pyatakov, had no intention of granting concessions to the Ukrainians. Ukraine was then regarded primarily as a source of food. The Bolshevik habit of mechanically measuring all conditions by the Russian yardstick can be seen at work when the Bolsheviks, crudely and without even the transitional period which had existed in Russia, attempted boldly to transplant the system of war communism to Ukraine. In Soviet Russia, the whole system of war communism, complete nationalization of industry and land, abolition of the free market, confiscation of the peasants' surplus produce, and compulsory employment reached its peak in 1919. The cardinal factor in Bolshevik occupation policy in Ukraine during the first months of 1919, however, was the existence of famine in Russia. In the wake of the advancing Red Army, the Moscow press wrote jubilant articles designed to appeal to the famished population. For example, the Moscow City Soviet on February 6, 1919 issued the following proclamation: "Comrades, the victory of the uprising of workers and peasants in Ukraine opens the way to save the workers and toiling masses of Russia from famine and economic disaster. The Ukrainian Red Army of workers and poor peasants has regained from the German imperialists and the local landowners, kulaks and bourgeoisie, very large reserves of grain, meat, fats, sugar, salt, fodder, coal, and in general, everything from the want of which the population of our cities is starving, suffering, and dying. Food reserves exceed tens of millions of poods. They offer salvation to us, our families, our children, and the entire causes of the proletarian revolution. Deliverance from famine and disaster is in our bands, it is near." Moscow's agents invaded the Ukrainian villages to supervise the requisition of foodstuffs. Hrystyuk describes how this worked out in practice. The workers' and peasants' government stripped Ukraine of everything it could lay its hands on, bread, sugar, meat, factory machine tools and equipment, farm implements, furniture from buildings, even musical instruments. By a simplified system of requisitioning, the Red Army men seized from Ukrainian peasants everything that could be removed: grain, cattle, poultry, plows, even women's clothes. On February 26, 1919, Pravda wrote, Ukraine now has approximately 250 to 300 million poods of extra grain. Before spring, Ukraine can deliver some grain, about 200,000 poods of frozen meat, 200,000 poods of salt, 300,000 poods of dried fruit, a large quantity of potatoes, almost 7 million poods of sugar, some confectionery products, and small quantities of millet. As Alexander J. Schlichter, then Commissar of Food Supplies of Ukraine, wrote in 1928, every pood of food was soaked in blood, according to his calculations. The government acquired by July 1 not 50 million poods, but only 8.5 million. However, even 3/4 of this amount remained in Ukraine and was rationed to proletarian centers, primarily to workers of the Donetsk Basin and to the Red Army. Only about 2 million poods were sent to Moscow and Petersburg. Neither the principles of the Communist program concerning the equality of nations, nor the Directory's proposal in January for peace and trade with Russia, nor the outbreak of revolutionary in Hungary in mid-March could check the onslaught of the hungry Russians from the north. Piatakov's thesis denying the existence of a national problem in Ukraine was ideological balm for the Moscow strategists, since it fitted in with the momentary needs as well as the desires of Soviet Russia. No less catastrophic than the food requisition policy was Bolshevik agrarian policy in Ukraine. The government held back about 3 million desyatins, or 25% of the land fund, former state-owned land, forests, sugar beet farms, and large estates which were transferred to agricultural communes. To obtain the remaining 75% of the land, the peasants had to seize it themselves. Here too, Bolshevik policy gave less consideration to the peasantry in Ukraine than it had in Russia. The failure of the Bolsheviks to solve economic problems in Ukraine was compounded by their blundering national policy. They simply refused to recognize Ukraine as a nation, not only politically but even culturally. Rakovsky declared in a meeting of the Kyiv City Council on February 13, 1919, that the attempt to institute Ukrainian as a state language was reactionary and entirely unnecessary. One is taught to remember the peasantry, but the peasants also regarded themselves as Russians. He repeated the old Russian contention that the Ukrainian cause and the very idea of a Ukraine were the inventions of Ukrainian intellectuals. Within 5 years, Rakovsky was to become a staunch defender of the rights of Soviet Ukraine. Rakovsky was criticized for his views by representatives of all the pro-Soviet parties. The left Bundesrathis warned, "Woe to that party, woe to that government which does not consider all the peculiarities of the country." The negative stand on the Ukraine question taken by Rakovsky, a Romanian who had been in Russia only since 1918, was the result of Russian influence, especially that of the Soviet administration in Ukraine, which was predominantly Russian and openly hostile to Ukrainian culture and ideas. The Soviet administration requisitioned buildings of Ukrainian culture institutions for state purposes and excluded the Ukrainian language from public use. In practice, the administration was even more anti-Ukrainian than the government. The foregoing factors provide an explanation of the unyielding Bolshevik attitude toward all pro-Soviet Ukrainian parties, the fury of the plundering Red Army, and the persecution of everything Ukrainian. In the nature of things, it would have been extraordinary had there been no reaction to the state of affairs engendered by the implementation of Bolshevik occupation policy. D. Borot'bism in crisis. 1. Internal party differences. The inability of the Borot'bisti to form their own government caused a serious crisis within their ranks. The Kyiv branch of the party resolved at a meeting held during the first half of February that, because ideologically and tactically, the Communist Party Bolshevik of Ukraine has recently come very close to the Ukraine Party of Socialist Revolutionaries Borot'bisti, the Central Committee of the UPSR Borot'bisti, and the interests of the world socialist revolution, and particularly of Ukraine, should call a party congress for the purpose of solving the problem of the possible forms of joint activity by both parties, the UPSR Borot'bisti and the CPBU. At a second meeting later in February, the Kiev group proposed outright merger in the following resolution. 1. Since there appeared to be no great differences of opinion between the UPSR Borot'bism and the CPBU in matters of basic tactics. 2. Taking into account the desire of the party rank and file to add to the name UPSR the word communist, or suitably to rename the UPSR altogether. 3. Warning the party that with its separate existence in opposition to the leaders of the CPBU, events and the party's support from reliable elements inevitably will lead it into the camp of counter-revolution. 4. Taking into account that there already exists the nucleus for a real communist party linked organizationally with communist parties of other countries and ideologically with their correct positions. 5. Regarding it as a duty to support these positions as much as possible. And 6. Considering it a duty to avoid the disorganization within the UPSR Borot'bism, which might arise if individual members or separate groups were to join the CPBU, the meeting in the interests of a successful development of the Socialist Revolution has resolved. To demand that the Central Committee of the party enter into negotiations with the Central Committee of the CPBU with a view to uniting the UPSR Borot'bism with the CPBU and effecting this merger successfully at the 5th Congress of the UPSR Borot'bism. Not only ideological but practical considerations as defined in point 3 of the resolution, Christiuk writes, played an important role in the desire to merge. As was expected, the Borot'bism called for a merger with the Bolsheviks at their 5th Congress, held in Kharkiv, March 6-8, 1919. It was at this Congress that the Borot'bism once again changed their party name, this time to Ukrainian Party of Socialist Revolutionaries, Communist Borot'bism. The danger of disorganization, which was feared by the Kievan Borot'bism, became acute when Vyacheslav Leshkevich, a member of the Central Committee and of the Council of Revolutionary Emissaries, Sergei Pilipenko, and many other party members individually joined the CPBU. Despite this threat, a merger of the Borot'bism and the Ukrainian Bolsheviks was impossible in March 1919. Not only did the Borot'bism as a whole still believe in their separate existence, the CPBU, flushed with victory, was not interested in bringing them into the CPBU or the Bolshevik government. 2. Rejection by the CPBU. The unification plea of the Borot'bism and of the Bund was firmly rejected by the CPBU at the latter's 3rd Congress in Kharkiv during the first week of March. By a small margin of votes, 101 to 96, the Congress adopted the resolution on the attitude toward petty bourgeois parties proposed by the CPBU's left wing. The following passages are relevant to the Borot'bism. 1. At a time of growing and intensified civil war in Ukraine, and in anticipation of an inevitable and violent kulak counter-revolution in the villages, no agreements with such parties as the Right SRs, the independent Ukrainian Social Democrats, and others are admissible. 2. Taking into account the fact that the victorious development of the proletarian revolution in Ukraine has deprived such strata of the petty bourgeoisie as urban craftsmen and the middle peasantry of any hope of realizing their program, and has proved the importance of their political parties, and the fact that in the course of events these parties, the Left Bund and the Ukrainian SR's Borot'bism, are compelled either to accept the platform of Soviet rule or to attempt to merge with our party. The 3rd Congress considers that, despite their acceptance of Soviet rule, these parties are incapable of accepting the program of the dictatorship of the proletariat, with all its consequences, and that therefore their representatives must not be given any responsible post in the councils. The Congress particularly emphasizes the fact that it is inadmissible to include them in the government of Ukraine, which should consist solely of representatives of the Communist Party, the only leader of the toiling revolutionary masses. Concerning attempts of the petty bourgeois parties, the Left Bund and Ukrainian SR's Borot'bism to unite with our party, the 3rd Congress of the CPBU has decided not to admit any groups in the ranks of our party and to accept new members only, in accordance with the party statute. Accordingly, no Borot'bism were admitted to the Bolshevik-controlled government, although the 3rd All-Ukraine Congress of Soviets, which was well attended by the Borot'bism, elected several Borot'bism deputies to the Central Executive Committee. To be sure, practice differed in local government. Unable to fill all positions in the local councils, the Bolsheviks were compelled to accept the Borot'bism participation. Having failed to reach an agreement with the CPBU despite great concessions, the UPSR Borot'bism communists, Like all other Ukrainian Soviet parties, Hrystyuk pointedly observes logically should have declared war on the CPBU and become an illegal organization, but the party inclined toward agreement at any price. E. Joint action against Grigory. 1. Bolshevik détente with the Borot'bism. The Bolsheviks had scarcely installed a central government in Ukraine when their multiple disregard of Ukrainian interests brought on widespread rebellion. By April 1919, the Bolsheviks had lost de facto control over large areas of Ukraine. From then on, as even the Bolshevik historian M. Kubanin admits, the revolutionary committees and councils existed only nominally and were in fact controlled by one or another ataman or underground organization. The population ignored the Bolshevik government's orders and lived under the protection of underground insurgent centers. Atamans Grigoryev, Zeleny, and Makhno all led their partisans in active rebellion. Only when faced with open revolt throughout Ukraine did the need to unite all revolutionary forces against counter-revolution prompt the Central Committee of the CPBU to adopt a resolution admitting the Borot'bism into the Ukrainian SSR Council of People's Commissars. The CPBU in May waived its March resolution against admission on direct orders from the Central Committee of the Russian Communist Party Bolshevik. All Soviet parties were admitted to the Central Executive Committee. Representatives of the Ukrainian SR's Communist Borot'bism were included in the Presidium of the Central Executive Committee and in the Council of People's Commissars of Ukraine. Borot'bism who were brought into the government included Mikhailo Panachenko, later replaced by Shumsky, as People's Commissar of Education, Litvinenko as Commissar of Finance, Lebedinets as Commissar of Justice, Poloz as Chairman of the Supreme Council of National Economy, and Yakovlev as Deputy Head of the Cheka in Ukraine. In these areas of government, the Borot'bism, although not active, were in a position to resist cultural Russification, check the economic plundering of Ukraine, and abate the campaign of terror then being conducted against Ukrainian intellectuals, perhaps despite the presence of Yakovlev. The posts of Deputy People's Commissar of Internal Affairs, Food and Communications were also held by the Borot'bism. However, Poloz was the only member of the Borot'bism Central Committee and the government, and no key commissariats were in the hands of the Borot'bism. Moreover, as Rafis aptly comments, this change in the center was scarcely reflected in the countryside, where the old policy remained in force. 2. Grigoryev's revolt against the Bolsheviks. D. Petrovsky, another Bolshevik historian, supports the view that the attempt to placate the Ukraine pro-Soviet parties was already late. In the period April 1 to May 1st, 1919, there were 93 uprisings. In the period May 1 to 15, 28 uprisings, and in the period June 1 to 19, 207 uprisings. The insurgent partisans were the same peasants who 2 and 3 months earlier had welcomed the Bolsheviks. Ukrainian peasants, poor and rich alike, joined in battle against the Russian Bolsheviks. The first large rebellion, occurring in early May and led by Ataman Grigoryev, spread rapidly through 3 provinces, destroying a great part of Bolshevik successes and facilitating the advance of Denikin. Not only did the proletariat mobilize its forces, but the petty bourgeois parties came out against Grigoryev. The RSDRP Mensheviks and the Bund rallied their forces in opposition to Grigoryev and Denikin. The left SR majority, the Borot'bism, and in the Ukrainian SD left independents also arrived at a decision to fight against the Grigoryev adventure. Only 2 parties support the Grigoryev, the Ukraine left SR's activists and the SD independence activists. By decree of the Council of Workers and Peasants' Defense, they were declared to be outside the law and subject to the Red Terror. Reduced to one partisan detachment, Grigoryev wrote to the government of the Ukrainian People's Republic on June 28, 1919. We broke away from you because you were conducting a petty bourgeois domestic and foreign policy which allowed the Entente powers to exploit our people and their wealth. We broke away from the communists and we will fight them because 90% of the people do not want communism and do not recognize the dictatorship of a party or dictatorship of an individual. In our view, it is necessary to have proportional representation of the nationalities in the councils. Tell us and the whole Ukrainian people what kind of rule you are bringing to Ukraine. For people say that you have an agreement with the Entente powers and that the National Union, which in our view is a nest of the Black Hundred, still exists. As for the land problem, socialization of the land is the only acceptable solution in Ukraine. We are in contact with the All-Ukraine Revolutionary Committee of the USDRP Independence. Rumors about our ties with Denikin and Kolchak are all lies. In general, Ataman Grigoriev remains an enigmatic figure. Some even refuse to believe that he was ever a Borot'bist. It is most probable that, like so many of the partisan leaders of the day, he was an independent ataman whom no party, either Borot'bist or Bolshevik, could discipline. After his break with the Borot'bisti, he acquired some notoriety for his anti-Jewish pogroms. In July, during an attempt to reach an understanding with Makhno, Grigoriev was shot at Makhno's headquarters. The reason is unknown, but presumably personal rivalry was involved. In January, the Borot'bisti had counted on the forces of Grigoriev to organize an independent Ukrainian Red Army. But by May, his active opposition to Bolshevik rule made him their enemy. Except for Grigoriev's about-face and the anti-Bolshevik uprising led by the Borot'bist Shchokhin, the Borot'bist party as a whole remained loyal to the Bolshevik government. Their participation in the government and active aid against the anti-Bolshevik partisan uprising had a double effect upon the party. While on the one hand the party became even more pro-Soviet, on the other hand it lost some of its adherents. That the party's influence among the peasants was still considerable, however, became evident during the All-Ukraine Congress of Volost Executive Committees in Kyiv in June 1919, at which the Borot'bisti controlled approximately 50% of the delegates. The forces of the Ukraine People's Republic approaching from the west and the armies of General Denikin moving in from the south and east occupied Kyiv on August 41, 1919. This date can therefore be considered as marking the formal end of the second period of Bolshevik rule in Ukraine. Hrystyuk justly remarked of the period that the groundwork for the Soviet government in Ukraine was prepared by the growth of the Ukraine Revolution, but the government itself rested ideologically on the Russian Communist Party and materially on the Russian Red Army and Russian bureaucracy.